Welcome to another one of your flipped lectures. Today we're going to talk about the Spanish-American War and the start of the American Empire. And the story of the Spanish-American War really begins a little bit earlier, with the Cuban War for Independence starting in 1895, in which Cubans are going to look to overthrow the Spanish Empire that had been controlling them. In the United States, public support for the Cuban Rebellion is actually very high. The United States had invested over $50 million in Cuba, and so free Cuba would give the United States more influence in the region. Also, Americans were sympathetic to the cause, believing that they themselves had fought to overthrow an imperial power. They saw Cubans as being similar. Also, kind of stories of Cuban suffering, war atrocities were blown out of proportion in the papers, and they began to get Americans emotionally on the side of the Cubans. And all this is fueled by something called yellow journalism, which basically is journalism that features exaggerated, kind of made-up stories to attract readers, where you sensationalize a story. And in this case, they're coming up with stories about the Cuban Rebellion, and they're going to be published in U.S. papers, and there's especially a very strong anti-Spanish kind of thread to all of these yellow journalists. So in response to kind of high tensions in Cuba, and also the fact that there was a lot of U.S. citizens in Cuba, the United States sent a ship, the USS Maine, to protect those citizens. But while it was sitting in the Havana harbor, the Maine exploded. It blew up in the middle of the night in the harbor. What happened next was a case of nobody actually knowing what happened. Some people believe that it was an accident, and other people jumped to the conclusion that it was Spain who had sunk the Maine. And so the catchphrase, "Remember the Maine," becomes the big catchphrase for the United States getting involved in war against Spain. And yellow journalism is going to contribute also to this call for war. And there are two really big newspapers who are fighting during this time for readers. William Randolph Hearst's The New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's The New York World. They both kind of rush to have more sensational stories and to call more for war, and so pretty soon most Americans believe that the Maine was blown up by Spain, even though a lot of the evidence pointed to the fact that it was only an accident. But again, kind of Americans reading things in the paper is going to convince them that Spain was in fact the enemy of the United States and had destroyed the Maine. And so these papers are going to end up leading to a big change in public opinion in favor of war. And Theodore Roosevelt, who was not a president or the vice president yet, he was simply kind of a politician at this time. He was in the president's, he was in the Navy. And so Theodore Roosevelt would say things like, "The president has no more backbone than a chocolate eclair." And Teddy Roosevelt was actually leading a lot of the calls for war with Spain. This is called jingoism. The idea of kind of very aggressive nationalism is known as jingoism. And so finally, President William McKinley decided to recognize Cuba as an independent nation and ask Congress to declare war. And so the United States in 1898 declared war on Spain and began to prepare to fight the empire. And Teddy Roosevelt, for his part, after kind of leading the push for war, resigned his government post, went to San Antonio, and recruited a group of volunteers to fight in the war. They became known as the Rough Riders, and Teddy Roosevelt's reputation in the war is going to actually launch his political career and contribute to him becoming both vice president and president of the United States. But this is where Theodore Roosevelt gains his fame. And at sea, the United States easily defeats what remains of the Spanish Navy. In the Philippines, out in the Pacific Ocean, the United States defeated the Spanish Navy and occupied the territory. So the Philippines were then under U.S. control. And in Cuba, the United States blockaded the island, leaving the troops on it kind of abandoned. And so we kind of could take a map and see what is happening at sea. And so the ground campaign, the Spanish-American War, lasts about 3.5 months. And the Army of the United States sends is very diverse. Volunteers kind of from all walks of American life. You have Teddy Roosevelt. And you also have a lot of minorities fighting this. 25% of all of the soldiers fighting the Spanish-American War are black soldiers. The term Buffalo Soldier is applied to the black soldiers in this war. So if we've heard the Bob Marley song, that's where that name comes from. And also the United States is going to occupy Puerto Rico, and they're going to win decisive victories in Cuba at San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill. And Teddy Roosevelt's charge up San Juan Hill is going to make him an American celebrity and a war hero. But the war is going to end very quickly. And after this war, the United States is going to have to decide what they are going to do with these new territories. And so the American Empire really begins by taking things from Spain, if we kind of take a good look at this cover. And Cuba was given their independence, as the United States promised, but a condition in the Cuban Constitution, called the Platt Amendment, gave the United States a lot of influence in Cuban government. It was very controversial, but the United States kind of forced it into the Cuban Constitution. Also, Puerto Rico was transferred to United States control and is still under United States control today. And then the United States had a big debate over the Philippines. And this debate was over whether the United States should become an imperial power, annex this territory, and set up the Philippines basically as a colony of the United States. Eventually a decision is made to annex the Philippines, which is going to really kind of be a big moment in American intervention overseas. And President McKinley, speaking on the Philippines, addressed his critics who said that they should have given the Philippines their independence, said this. He said, "We could not give them back to Spain, for that would be cowardly and dishonorable. We could not turn them over to France or Germany, for that would be bad for business and discreditable. That we could not leave them to themselves, for they were unfit for self-government. And finally, that there is nothing left for us to do than to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them." And McKinley's quote kind of shows one of the cultural causes behind this era of imperialism. And that's this idea of the white man's burden. This phrase was coined by a guy called Rudyard Kipling. You know him best as the person who wrote the Jungle Book. But this new imperialism of the United States and Europe needs a justification. And so it gets painted as a noble enterprise. And this is a good example of ethnocentrism, where the civilized Western countries, the United States and the European countries, have a responsibility, a burden to rule over and help the uncivilized develop. And so imperialism gets kind of wrapped up in notions of racial and cultural superiority, and that is going to help justify a lot of the things during this time. William McKinley is assassinated in 1901, and so Theodore Roosevelt, the hero of San Juan Hill, the Spanish-American War, rises to the presidency. And Theodore Roosevelt changes American diplomacy radically. He believes that competition and conflict is what keeps individuals strong, and so he believed that nations should also should do the same thing. He believed in American exceptionalism, the duty to spread American values, and his foreign policy was speak softly and carry a big stick. The United States should not boast or speak much in the world, but that they should have a strong global military presence to either influence or deter other people from acting. And a good example of the big stick is in Panama in 1903. And of interest to the United States and many other industrial powers was a canal that could go through Panama to cut the journey to the Pacific Ocean by a very significant amount of miles. But Colombia controlled Panama during this time, and Colombia refused to sign an agreement with the United States to build the canal. So, the United States sent their navy to Panama in order to help the Panamanians win independence from Colombia in 1903. So in return for this help, the Panamanian government signed a deal with the U.S. to actually build the canal. And this was actually very controversial in the United States. Whether the United States should go around intervening in the affairs of other places was really not a settled issue. But the United States did build the Panama Canal, and they finished it in 1914. And so, as we can see, kind of Teddy Roosevelt is a controversial figure during this time, but it shows him kind of building the Panama Canal, but the question is, for whom? Is it for the Panamanians or for the Americans? And even today, the Panama Canal continues to be a very important place for trade between the United States and the Pacific Ocean. And so Teddy Roosevelt is best well known for coming up with a foreign policy called the Roosevelt Corollary. And the Roosevelt Corollary takes the Monroe Doctrine a step further. And what the Corollary says is that the United States could, and would intervene in Latin American affairs to help keep economic and political stability in the Western Hemisphere. So Teddy Roosevelt says the United States government is essentially claiming the right to always intervene in their part of the world. Again, kind of a very controversial foreign policy. So kind of if we take a good picture at this for a second, we can figure out just exactly what the Roosevelt Corollary is talking about. And the Roosevelt Corollary first went into action in the Dominican Republic, where the Dominican Republic owed a bunch of debts to European powers. And so rather than allow Europeans the excuse to go into the Dominican Republic and Santo Domingo in order to kind of take it over to collect their debts, the United States stepped in and they collected the debts owed to Europe. And so this sets a precedent to the United States, being kind of the big power in the Western Hemisphere and also being very involved in Latin America. And in 1908, the next progressive president, William Howard Taft, is elected. And he is going to change the diplomacy a little bit, pursuing a policy of what is known as dollar diplomacy, where rather than use bullets, the United States is going to use dollars to try to influence developing countries. And dollar diplomacy stresses the investment in the industry of developing countries. And the idea of dollar diplomacy is that everybody could benefit. U.S. businesses could make money, and the people in Latin America and Asia get a better quality of life, and they can build up their country. But this has some negative consequences. As kind of we can see in the globalized world today, those arrangements do not always benefit everyone. And so to summarize, American imperialism. This idea kind of begins with manifest destiny and Western expansion. It has different economic, political, and cultural causes. It begins with Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, as well as the United States' influence in Cuba, Panama, and in parts of Asia. This idea, like today, back in the 1900s, caused fierce debate over whether this was a good policy or not. But ultimately, it's going to change the way the United States relates to the countries of the world. The United States is going to have a larger military presence, which is going to continue up till today. The idea of interventions into other countries is going to become the norm. Also, the globalizing of the economy and the fierce belief in American exceptionalism is all going to now play into American foreign policy over the next 100 years.